All right, let's start our interview. And first of all, for all of our viewers and listeners, welcome back. I've had a very busy and productive summer, writing all kinds of things. So you haven't seen too many, if any, major videos from me. And I think the last audio podcast goes back to June. So I'm happy to be able to do this with Dan Abella. We had a great conversation, Dan and I, in December 2021 about Dan's book. But tonight we're going to talk about a psychedelic festival that Dan is organizing. It's going to be presenting both images, visual material, and music. And let me just start this off by saying, having grown up myself in the psychedelic era in the 1960s, and having been reading at that point some of Hegel, not that I'm so serious, but I was in a philosophy class then at the City College of New York, and I was impressed with one of Hegel's ideas, not his dialectic, which was interesting for sure, but Hegel had the notion of what he called the spirit of an age. And what he meant by that is if you look at any time and you look carefully enough, and sometimes it's more obvious than other times, you'll see that all kinds of art and literature tend to converge around a common theme. So, for example, if you think about Impressionism, you have Mallarmé, the poet, Debussy, the composer and musician, and of course, Claude Monet, the impressionistic artist. And it struck me back then in the 60s that the psychedelic era was the spirit of that age. So let me start this conversation off by asking you, Dan, do you think that age is still with us? Or is your festival about sort of retrieving and calling back that age?
Oh no, absolutely. The age is still with us. It's naturally, if anything, it's much more less counter-establishment and more establishment. Uh, Proof of that is that we've seen what used to be psychedelics that were regarded as class four substances and not, for possibly criminalization. Right now, they're being decriminalized, and in some instances, they're being used to treat people with PTSD. And it's something unheard of back in the 60s. So, absolutely, I think it's being repackaged in a more mainstream way, less unpredictable, so to speak. So I definitely think it's with us. So our festival has clearly throwbacks to that period in history, which is not just about music. It was about an attitude towards life, but it also brings in also some current trends in the psychedelic movement.
Right. So let's talk about that attitude towards life. And obviously, Timothy Leary was a major champion and leader of that movement. And one of the things that I always found both interesting, provocative, maybe I agreed with some of it, other parts maybe I didn't agree with, was the idea that you should go inward into the human mind and psyche and project that upon the world. And that is somewhat distinct from something else that I was always very interested in, which is getting off this planet, going out into the cosmos and seeing firsthand how it looks. So how do you look at that psychedelic area? Is it just going inside the mind and projecting out, or is it taking in the larger cosmos?
It's actually both. I think that the shamanic traditions, uh, a lot of our cherished shamanic traditions, whether it be in Tibetan or even Native American, talk about and the universe is always talking to us, whether it be internally through our thoughts and our hunches, through our body, and through what is the field. So I think that when back then, when Timothy Leary was talking about, or at least the idea that we had to go inward, maybe that was a reaction to the very stratified way of thinking people were engaging at that time. Uh, so the idea is to break down those old patterns and give birth to new ways of approaching the world. But I've really come to realize that information, or what you call signals, take place anywhere. I mean, it could be out there in the universe telling us, uh, here in our thoughts and in our inside our bodies, and we're always getting the universe is always communicating to us. It's always telling us, or at least nudging us in maybe the best direction for us. But as humans, we tend to be very stubborn about that, and sometimes go our own way and only have to learn the hard way.
Well, there's no doubt we're a very stubborn species. Other species are stubborn too. Anyone
Yeah,
who's had a dog, if a dog doesn't want to do what you want it to do, the dog usually
exactly.
has its way. Cats are even worse. I mean, they basically value their own feelings and sensibilities more than what their human friends might want for them. But let's get more specific. Perhaps you can share with our viewers and listeners some of what is going to be presented at the festival in terms of the music, the artists, the filmmakers,
Sure.
etc.
Well, I want to start off with two what I refer to major attractions that the festival has this year. Um, One of them has Matthew Modine's "I Am Who You Imagine." It's a short that was put together by Modine and a former worker with the 2001 Space Odyssey, a narrator there. It's a very surreal short on the nature of reality. In a way, I also thought about the idea of acting, right? So I was wondering if he's also playing with us as I am who you imagine me to be, thinking about me, Matthew Modine, being the soldier, the husband, the lover, and so on. But it's also this idea that we project these roles out there into the world, to other people, and into the universe. So it's short, but I'm really excited about that because it's Matthew's it's going to be a New York premiere, and hopefully he'll be. As you know, he's a New York native, so hopefully he should be either attending by live or through our online version. The second one is Dennis McKenna's. As some of your readers or viewers might remember, uh, Dennis McKenna is a brother of Terence McKenna, the very famous psychonaut and ethnobotanist and kind of a poet writ large. And he is one of his projects is called Bionosis, and the idea is to catalog and preserve some of the vanishing biodiversity that's taking place in the Amazon rainforest regarding plants, which are quickly disappearing. And some of these plants may have really uh, very salutary medicinal properties. So his goal, the McKenna Academy, is attempting to at least catalog and sample what exists within that world. So that's I'm sure Dennis will join us again on online on Sunday. He's right now all the way in Vancouver, so I doubt that he'll be here live. But hey, you never know. But so those are the two main ones. But I would say overall, what the festival has is a fairly eclectic selection of films, from experimental Stan Brakhage type of films to surreal, eh, to films inspired or influenced by Jodorowsky or Gaspar Noé, to more mainstream documentaries on the beneficial use of certain uh, psychedelics. So it really, we try to cover the full arc of altered states. It's not just about taking, DMT or ayahuasca or mushrooms. It's about drumming or chanting or anything that we can do to get us out of that mindset, like the mainstream reality tunnel, which Robert Anton Wilson talked about. The reality tunnel. Any way to break out of that will be hugely beneficial. And so our goal is not just to promote one style of one practice, but as many as we can get our hands into.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned psychedelic films. One of my favorite songs of all time, and it surprises people, because it was sung by Engelbert Humperdinck, who you
Mm,
don't think of as a rather hip singer, but one of his biggest hits is a song Les Bicyclettes de Belsize, and it came out like in the mid to late 1960s, and it was actually part of a short psychedelic movie
mm.
by the same name, and it takes place in some, I don't think it's a real park in London. Some guy is walking in the park, falls in love with a woman, and they have a whole psychedelic adventure. So there's a lot to be said about psychedelic films. The other point you mentioned when you were first talking about this, and it reminded me, apropos of John Lennon, of I am the walrus, because when you start talking I am he and you are he and what,
Right.
that is like a classic psychedelic trope if you think about it. But let me ask you another question. How did you come to get all these films? Are these films you've been loving for your whole life, or did you go on like a merry quest just in the past year to collect all these films for the
Well,
festival?
first of all, a lot of these films have never been released, so they're like first run films, shorts and documentaries. Most of them were made in 2022 to 2023. So what we do is we have a few platforms where we promote the festival, and they're fairly well-known platforms. So people go in and I think being that our festival now is in its sixth season, we kind of developed a reputation for appealing to those kind of films. It's a niche market. I mean, it's not for everyone, but for those who really appreciate the whimsical kind of almost uh, derangement of, say, you would find in Alejandro Jodorowsky, or familiar with the works of Breton or some of the psychedelic songs, I think they would find a place here. I mean, because our goal is to showcase films that are new talent. So it's not just the people from back in the past, but the new ones who might be the new, the new directors of the future. So all within that cycle, that kind of trope or that kind of theme that we organize. So um, we have these platforms, and every so often we will get outliers who will reach out to us and say, "I have this great film. Will you be interested in looking at it and maybe screening it at our festival?" And then one of our programmers does that.
It's interesting, during the 1960s, as I'm sure you well know, it was much more difficult to make any kind of movie or film than it is today, simply because the technology of filmmaking has evolved to the
Oh yeah,
point where you can practically make a film if you have a relatively recent iPhone and or any kind of mobile phone. And in a way, the distance between what's inside our brain has gotten much closer to what we can capture of what we're thinking and what's going on in the outside world. Have you made any psychedelic films or done any psychedelic work yourself, by the way?
oh yeah. Well, I got into organizing festivals because I was originally a short and a feature director. I directed a film called the kind of a psychedelic sci-fi called The Final Equation. It's about a scientist who discovers the missing pieces to Einstein's unified field theory. By doing so, he kind of opens up this rabbit hole where he starts he's not able to tell what's real from what's dreamlike, and part of it has to do with the implications of what the final equation is. So it kind of got me thinking along those lines. It's yeah, I've done that. I've done also some shorts that have to do with under the influence, so to speak.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Not being able to tell what's real and what's fantastical. Lewis Carroll, in a way, is correctly recognized as one of the pioneers in psychedelic work
Yeah,
in terms of what he wrote. And he's one of the people, you always ask if you could go back in time, who would you like
right.
to have a conversation with? Lewis Carroll would be certainly in my top 10.
And we might even let's look at a film like The Wizard of Oz. That's very psychedelic.
That's
And
right.
it's very psychedelic. So I think part of the goal of our festival is to kind of break down the kind of stereotypes people have about what's a drama film, a psychedelic film, what's a science film or science fiction film. Break them down because at the end of the day, they're just arbitrary boundaries that we create sometimes for specific reasons. But other than that, they're much more fluid. And let's look at 2001. That's a psychedelic film, if there ever was any. Especially, I remember when I was watching that first time around. I was just a kid at that time, and I remember watching it and see this gigantic cosmic baby. That kind of blew my mind. Where is that coming from? That's very psychedelic. So the idea of the interaction of the apes with the monolith in the beginning of the film, again, very psychedelic. It's metaphysical. It's transcendental. And these are the terms that I think people would benefit from. It's like probably our most cherished kind of films tend to cross the boundary between straight up narrative science fiction into the transcendental psychedelic realm. Altered States, that's another one. Ken Russell. So these films, I remember watching Altered States when it first came in, and I was when I came out of that theater, I was like, my mind was buzzing. So if I had taken some substance, I was like really disoriented. So that kind of has tell me these films can have that kind of impact on people and for in a useful way, you know.
Absolutely. Just a word about labels. This is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. One of the reasons is because my first science fiction novel was a hybrid, The Silk Code. It was both science fiction and mystery. The hero is a New York forensic detective who gets involved in a science fictional case. And the question of where would this novel be shelved? You wouldn't believe how places like Barnes and Noble and Borders in those days, they agonized over that.
Right.
And that's me and the publisher. And I remember as the author, I said, well, why don't you just shelve them in both places? Put some in the mystery section and some in the science fiction section. And they said, no, they thought that would confuse readers. But I mean, labels are important, I guess, because if you think about cuisine, if there is a restaurant that advertises Japanese cuisine, and you go into the restaurant and all you see offered is veal piccata and chicken parmesan and so on. Well, you're obviously in an Italian cuisine place, and you're going to be annoyed that you walked in thinking it would be Japanese cuisine. So in a way, when it comes to popular culture, that same thing applies. On the one hand, labels are annoying, but on the other hand, the people who put these things out, whether it's movies, novels, music, want to be able to attract people who will know what they're getting into. But let me just ask you a question. Apropos of the relationship of science fiction to psychedelic issues, you also have been putting on a wonderful Philip K. Dick festival for years. I've had the pleasure of participating in it several times. I know you're going to be doing that again in the coming year. And I would imagine that someone like Philip K. Dick would be someone whose work would be very appropriate to a psychedelic festival.
Absolutely. I think that Philip K. Dick, if the more I read about him and what he how he approached, the more I realized that we all share a lot of things in common. I mean, uh, as you know, as many of your viewers might know, Philip K. Dick was a science fiction writer, author of Blade Runner, and other um, films and other books. But he in the '60s he did definitely take a lot of amphetamines. He was not so much a psychedelic user. He claimed to have taken LSD 2 or 3 times. He says, and then back in this, and obviously that didn't do that well. Didn't do it impacted him very well. So I mean, even wrote a novel, Scanner Darkly, talking about the dangers of excessive psychedelics. So, um, but Phillips K. Dick really was someone who had a psycho. You could say almost had a a mystical or psychedelic experience when he was hit by a beam of pink beam that knocked him on the floor, and then he first was in first century Rome, and was wondering what happened. So you could almost claim that there was an endogenous psychedelic experience, something that came out of nowhere. So yeah, I think he would really would appreciate what we're doing in terms of the kind of films where we are. For instance, he was good friends, so he actually was in touch with Julian Jaynes, who wrote the Origin of Consciousness, and that was in the late '70s. That's when nobody knew about Julian Jaynes. He just book just came out and back in the late '70s. So he was in touch with him, but he also thought that David Bowie's "The Man Who Fell to Earth" was like the best representation of what he wanted to write about. So I think that I think people sometimes ask me, well, how do you reconcile, right? Doing a psychedelic and doing a science fiction. I said there's nothing to reconcile. It goes down to the inspiration as is Philip K. Dick, and I think he's much more eclectic and he's much more universal than other sci-fi writers who tend to, for one reason or another, tend to stick to specific tropes like say space operas or what. And it's fine, but he seemed to really he called himself a fictionalizing philosopher. And incidentally, what got me into Philip K. Dick was I've always been a big fan of Borges, the Argentinian metaphysician or poet or writer. So when I heard by Ursula Le Guin saying we have our own homegrown Borges, I said, who is this person? I need to read him. I need to find out. So I started reading his latest books backwards, which is kind of an odd way of starting, but from Valis and the Divine Invasion and Radio Free Albemuth all the way to the beginning. So it's been a long ride, but it's still growing, and we're really excited about the kind of people that are responding to our festival.
Well, I have a secret that I don't think I've ever told anybody this, so maybe word will get out that I'm divulging this, and it'll get more people to listen to and watch this video. But as I've mentioned many, many times, my favorite all-time science fiction series and trilogy is the Foundation
Oh
series,
yeah,
the original Foundation trilogy. But I don't think I've ever revealed before that the first novel in that trilogy that I read was the second Foundation novel, which is the third novel in the series.
wow.
Because it's a long, long story. I'm not sure if I ever told you the story. I one day got called down to the junior high school library by the librarian, and she was bringing me in. She was very concerned about something. She had a very serious expression on her face. And I said, what's the problem? And she hands me like this sheet, and I can see what the problem was. She's saying, and then I hear her saying to me, Paul, we're very concerned about you. You're only reading one thing. You've probably heard this already. Of course, everything I was reading was science fiction. And then she offers me this brilliant analogy. She said, if all you do is eat one thing, you'll get physically ill. All you do is read one thing, you'll get mentally ill. So we're not going to let you read any more science fiction. So I said, okay, fine. I never went back to that library. What I did is I walked to the local library on Allerton Avenue in the Bronx. And as Asimov's name was, of course, in the first shelf, because it's filed in alphabetical order. And I saw the book Second Foundation. I was a little kid, so I basically took the book out, loved it, and then I got back and read the first two books in the series. So I'm mentioning that because reading backwards, I have a feeling when it comes to trilogies and series is a much more common thing than you might realize. Or people might realize, but I do have a couple of things to say about Philip K. Dick. First of all, I think he's right about The Man Who Fell to Earth, and I have to say, I don't know if you saw it. There was a sequel series of The Man Who Fell to Earth.
No, I didn't see that. But yeah,
I won't say too much because I don't want to give much away. Usually these sequel series, especially when they come up like 30, 40 years later,
right.
are more annoying than they are satisfying. And by the way, I find that to some extent the problem with the Foundation series on Apple TV Plus. There are things I really love about it, but a lot of it is annoying. But in terms of the sequel series of The Man Who Fell to Earth, which was on, it was streaming about a year or two ago, probably still is up there. I highly recommend that if you enjoyed The Man Who Fell to Earth. They really did the original movie justice, and they do it very well. The other thing about Philip K. Dick, of course, is even in his best known work, The Man in the High Castle, which I think is just an absolute masterpiece, the way in which the different realities have some knowledge of each other is not a scientific way. It basically is Buddhist Taoistic.
Yes, yes.
So, and so that was written when in the early to mid 1960s, and he even then, whether he realized it or not, he was very much enjoying and was a part of this inner mental world and how it interacts, with the outside world. We haven't talked all that much about music. Are you going to have any live performances at the?
No, not this year. We're gonna have some music videos, some amazing psychedelic groups that are we'll be having them, and they all revolve around the themes that how, the themes of the blocks. For instance, we have one dealing with horror and psychedelic. We have certainly a music, kind of a stoner rock style music, and then we have one that is more surrealistic. So we don't have any live bands because it's really we did that for a couple years, and not to say we won't do it again. But here in New York City, it's really tricky getting people to show up at anything, at any for a live band. As you know, you might be aware that the first year when we did it in 2018, we had the composer of we flew in the composer and his band from of Jodorowsky's Santa Sangre, which is a very, very well-known surrealistic film, and it was well attempted, not really to the level that we thought we could, and same for some local psychedelic bands, but it's more tricky getting that. Plus, let's not even to mention organize, talking to the actual club owners with the cabaret license, and there's a whole new level. But in the future, we might definitely we come across some live bands that are really with a local following that can pull in those numbers. Absolutely, this is something that really we do it from year to year.
Well, that makes sense. So I'm just thinking, I wonder if the Strawberry Alarm Clock, if any members of that group are still alive, right? They had that song Incense Peppermint. It was like a classic
Oh yes, yes, I remember
song.
that.
Yeah, it was a pretty good song, but not a great song, but it sort of typified. Yeah, the truth of the matter is, during its height, the psychedelic influence on rock music in the late 60s, even going into the 70s, really most of the successful groups, even if they weren't primarily a psychedelic group, they did psychedelic music. But the Strawberry Alarm Clocks was from beginning to end psychedelic. The Moody Blues, of course, did psychedelic
Of
music
course,
as
yeah.
well. I have no idea if they're still performing. I think Justin Hayward is still singing somewhere.
I think, yeah, I think they are. I remember seeing something recently that a lot of these groups are the ones that are still alive. I mean, fortunately, many of them and their members have passed away, but many of these groups are still performing, 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it's a really there was a show, and I can't quite remember. Maybe it was called The Name of the Game or something. It was starring Gene Barry in the 1960s, and they had an episode in the 1960s in which he is transported in some kind of time warp to the 1990s, and he goes into a club, and he sees a group. They weren't the Rolling Stones, but they sort of looked like the Rolling Stones with their hair dyed white and gray, and they put on like aging makeup and like a ridiculous 60s style, still singing songs. And everyone was laughing about that, how ridiculous it was. Nobody's going to be listening to that music, 30 years from now. And of course, we're still listening to that music. So from the 1960s to the 2020s, that's a pretty good long-lasting period. So when is this festival going to take place?
The festival is October 20th through 22nd. So Friday and Saturday are going to be live in-person events. And we expect, right now we have a good number of filmmakers that have confirmed that will be attending. So there will definitely be Q&A after their performances. And then Sunday we're putting together not the complete festival, but the best which we feel are most appropriate for online, the online version. And of course, those will include Matt Modine's film as well as Dennis McKenna's short documentary called it's gonna be all day on Saturday. I think it's gonna be like 13 hours of films. We're actually gonna be screening close to 60 shorts and features. And
Wow, that's great. Well, okay, I tell you, go ahead. You're going to say
And I
something.
I also want to mention that I'm also as you mentioned at the beginning of this interview that I'm still going ahead with the theater of the mind. So there'll be like a small workshop uh during lunch hour between 12 and 1:30 that I'll be putting together for those who are interested in connecting with themselves. That's sort of a takeoff on the theater of the mind, and because as you might know that during the day I work with I'm kind of a therapist, counselor, coach, however you wanted to call me. So I work with people with PTSD and anxiety disorders and so on. And part of the goal here is to uh, provide people with some practices or some that can help them deal with these issues uh, and prevent the dependency so much that is being promoted by pharmaceutical companies.
That's great. That's really important work, and it's the classic example of what I think I actually heard years ago in some movie where there was a person with severe psychological problems, but he was able to live a fairly normal and productive life. And somebody asked him, "How were you able to get over those problems?" And he said, "It's art. It's the art that I imbibe. It keeps me sane and keeps me operating." And I think that's a very, very important point. By the way, speaking of art, do you yet have a poster for this festival? Because what I'll do is I'll put it at the beginning of the video. And again, for all of our viewers and listeners, these are how decisions are made about what you see in an interview. So if Dan has a poster, you will have seen it already at the beginning of this interview.
Yes, I said I'll definitely get a something to you after uh, after this interview. We have right now we have two kinds of posters. One that just announces the festival, but the other one announces the festival with the date. That
Good.
I'm not gonna have it ready for you till maybe early next week.
Okay. Well, send me whatever you have now because I'll put it up anyway. And you mentioned the dates in the
Yep.
conversation, so I can put them even over the poster so people will see that.
Right.
Uh, so I'm just looking. So today, and our listeners and viewers might want to know this. It is a little past 8:30 p.m. on Thursday, September 28th. You'll probably be seeing this on YouTube either later tonight or at most tomorrow, Friday, September 29th. And then later that same day, if you don't have a video and you have a podcast, an audio podcast that you listen to, you'll find that in my podcast, Light On, Light Through, which sort of sounds psychedelic in itself, doesn't it? I got that
Yes.
phrase from Marshall McLuhan, by the way. So anyone who's interested can sort of do a little research on that. So listen, Dan, it was a real pleasure to interview you again, and I'm sure we'll be working together in some way in the future. Keep up the great work. You're making a lot of people healthy and happy with your good work.
Well, thank you for having me again, Paul. And it's always a pleasure to, share some old memories and also really share with others about the possibilities that lie ahead. So it's not everything is in the past. There's some stuff in the future too. So we just got to know where to look. And hopefully we can provide some directions at our festival.
Absolutely. As far as I'm concerned, I look at every day, life is just beginning. There's
Yeah,
a whole road ahead of you. And
exactly. Life is about it's constantly informing us of where to go, what it's just we have to just be open our eyes and our ears to that.
absolutely. All right, Dan, we'll do this again sometime soon. Good luck with the festival. I'll promote it to the absolute hilt, and I hope it does attract a lot of people.
Thank you, and I'll definitely have Jonathan send you a link. So, and you're more than welcome to come and if you're in the area that day to show up for our live presentation as well.
Yeah, I'll try to, as a matter of fact. I'm on Cape Cod right now, but I'll be back in
Oh,
the city by then for sure.
okay, absolutely. Either one will definitely be able to connect.
All right. Take care then.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Paul.